Hi, in this section we're going to talk about what is called the canon of the Old Testament. I don't know if you've heard that term before, but it's an important term, so we'll go over it. So, what is the canon? Well, let's think about first what the word canon means. A canon comes from a Greek word canon, meaning a straight rod or bar or rule. So think of a modern ruler in a sense like a yardstick is a ruler. So a canon, in terms of the Bible, is some sort of standard by which we measure whether a particular book should be included in the Bible or should be excluded. So we talk about a canon as essentially a list of books that we consider to be biblical. So, relative to the Old Testament, it's important to realize that there are different canons for different religious groups. Now, this may be old hat to you, or this may be entirely new to you, but it's also very important. So, I think it's easiest to start off talking about the Jewish canon. So, we'll begin with the Jewish canon and then we'll move forward to Christian canons. So the origins of the Jewish canon of the Bible are relatively obscure, and a lot has been written to try to figure out how did this list or collection of books actually come together, and we're really not quite sure. A lot of scholars disagree as to exactly when this happened. Certainly, the process started before the time of Jesus and was completed, I don't know, maybe within a couple of hundred years after the time of Jesus. So, somewhere in there, people started to get concerned about which books should be included or excluded. And ultimately, a consensus was reached over time. Now, there are some scholars and some books that talk about um, a council of Jewish rabbis that sat down and actually hammered out what the list should be. And this theoretical council goes by two names, either the Council of Jamnia or the Council of Yavne, which are both places in Galilee. And this theory seemed to catch on, but ultimately the theory was really based on a very imaginative reading of what is called the Talmud, which is another Jewish authoritative work. And really, what's in the Talmud doesn't really talk about an actual council. So, if you see books that talk about some sort of Jewish council that sat down and hammered out what books were in the Bible, there's really no basis for that. So, I just wanted to point that out. Again, I think there wasn't a huge controversy about most of the books in the Old Testament at the time of Jesus as to what those books should be. Some were probably um, questioned, but in terms of the first five books of the Bible, particularly, and the major prophets, which would be Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, I think those were pretty much settled as um, valuable religious works by the time of Jesus. And it's important to remember that the book, as we know it, so a book with two covers and pages in between, wasn't invented until around the beginning of the 4th century AD. So the book itself comes along quite a bit later than Jesus. And before that time, biblical texts were recorded on scrolls. And essentially, there was a scroll per book. We'll talk about some exceptions to that. But you probably, now we collect an entire Bible that has all the books in them. But at that time, chances are a synagogue here and there would not have had all of the scrolls or all the same scrolls. They may have had all the major books, but Some of the collections probably varied. Scrolls were very expensive. So the Jewish canon divides the Hebrew Bible, or what they would just call the Bible, into three sections. The first section is called the Torah, so that's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. I'm sure you've probably heard this term Torah before. Now, the term Torah also has a broader meaning within Judaism, that because the word itself just means instruction. So when Jews talk casually about doing Torah study, what they would really mean is something closer to what we think of as Bible study. So Torah study may include studying books that aren't the first five books of the Bible. Or it may include just sort of general religious study, but Jews will often call that Torah study. For Christians, the first five books of the Bible are sometimes referred to as the Pentateuch. So penta meaning five. So these are the first five books. So far, Jews and Christians are on the same route here. Now, the next set of books are called the prophets. And we'll talk later in the course about why some of these books are considered prophetic. But they have Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel. Now, the reason Samuel is divided into two books is basically because it's very long, and really too long to be on one scroll. So uh, the tradition divided the book of Samuel into two pieces, two scrolls. It was a two-scroll book. However you want to think about that, whether you want to think of it as two books or one book divided into two scrolls, take your pick. The same thing being the case for 1st and 2nd Kings. Again, too long to be on one scroll. And then we have three important books called, at least with Christians, the major prophets. And these are Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. And the reason these three books are called major prophets is not because of their relative importance, but because of their relative length. So if you look at each of these three books, you'll notice that they're quite long. And so they get grouped together not because of chronology and not because of importance, but because of size, which is kind of interesting. Then we have what's called the Book of the 12. So this is kind of the flip side version of 1st and 2nd Samuel. All of these prophetic books are very short. And so it was deemed more convenient to just include them all together in one scroll. So Obadiah, for example, in your English Bible is probably not more than a page long. So some are super short. So that includes Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. So books that you're probably already familiar with. So these grouped together are sometimes referred to by Jews as the Book of the 12. Sometimes Christians call these minor prophets. Again, they are minor not because they are minor in importance, but because they are smaller or shorter in length. And then Jews have a final section called the writings. So the writings include Psalms, Job, Proverbs, Ruth, Song of Songs, Ecclesiastes, Lamentation, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So these aren't exactly prophetic, and they're not exactly part of the Torah, so everything else just goes to, is classified as writings. Now, Jews have one, you might say, authoritative text or one copy of the Bible that they still consider authoritative, and that is what is called the Leningrad Codex. So a codex is just another fancy word for a book, and it is a copy of what is called the Masoretic text, which is a particular, I would say, scholarly tradition of copying the Bible. And that Leningrad Codex is not unsurprisingly located in Russia, so you can actually go look at it if you like, if you want to travel to Russia. This copy of the Bible is dated 1008 AD, or in the Common Era, so it's very old, but it's relatively, 11th century. I don't know, is that old or not? It's pretty old for us, but considering the Bible began to be written about 1000 BC, you might say it's fairly new. One little aside here is you may have heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were excerpts or pieces of the Bible found near Jerusalem back in the 1940s and 50s. And these copies were dated beginning around 200 years before Jesus. So scholars got really excited because they found copies of the Bible that were a full 1,000 years older than the oldest copy that we have, which is pretty amazing. So that's why they created such a stir. So, just a note for interfaith relations: contemporary Jews would not likely use the term Old Testament because they have no New Testament. So, Jews typically just use the term Bible. So, when Jews refer to Bible, they refer to what we would call the Old Testament. Or they might use the term Hebrew Bible, which is just the same thing. And the reason it's called the Hebrew Bible is almost everything in the Bible is written in Hebrew. There are a few parts of the Bible that are written in a language called Aramaic that Jesus would have spoken. It's very closely related to Hebrew. So if you want to know what the Leningrad Codex looks like in real life, you can look at it online. It's all copied and available for your reading pleasure, but this is just an example of what it looks like. So let's move to the Protestant canon, which is essentially the same as the Jewish canon, so that makes our process pretty easy. But the book order is different. So if we go back and we look at, let's flip all the way back here, we see the last books in the Jewish Bible are 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And the last book in the English Bible, or the not English Bible, but the Protestant Bible would be these minor prophets, beginning with Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. So those would be the last books of the Protestant Bible. Go back to where we were here. And in some sense, this is a little complicated, but the rationale behind what makes a book canonical can be different between, sort of depending on what kind of Protestant you talk to. So, liturgical Protestants like Lutherans and Anglicans, Episcopalians, tend to think of canon as something formed organically by tradition. And over the course of time, people reach a consensus, and that is sort of what makes a canon. There are other Protestants, more evangelical Protestants, or some evangelicals, that would think of canon more in relationship to an inspired author. So, thinking about a particular author, whether that author was inspired, and then therefore what that author produced, that should be part of the Bible. Now, this is a little troublesome because if we think of a book like 1st and 2nd Samuel, even though it bears the name Samuel, Samuel actually dies pretty early on in the first book. So it can't have been written by Samuel, so who actually wrote it? And the answer is we really don't know who wrote it. So there's some theoretical problems there. We'll just leave it at that. You should know that the Episcopal Church sets out the official canon, the official list of books that should be in the Old Testament via adoption of the Articles of Religion in 1801. So if you want to look at that, it's in the prayer book. Take a look and you can see the official list. It's all set out right there. Now let's move on to the Catholic canon. So the Catholic canon is the same as the Protestant canon, but it contains some additional material. And those additional books would be 1st and 2nd Maccabees, a different, longer version of Daniel, a different, longer version of Esther, so containing the same information of the Daniel and Esther that we have in our Bibles, but some additional material in each of those books. A book called Tobit, Judith, Wisdom, Baruch, and Sirach. So Catholic Bibles are actually longer than Protestant Bibles. Catholics would refer to these additional books as deuterocanonical, meaning that they are, I guess, literally second canon. So Catholics would say that these books are somehow on list number 2, but by the same token, they are no less Bible than all of the other books in the Bible. Protestants, however, will generally refer to them as apocrypha or apocryphal. So apocryphal would be the adjective. Certain Catholics would take offense if you call these extra books apocryphal because they think that that's sort of a denigration to these books of the Bible. So they would prefer the word deuterocanonical. And the difference between the Catholic and Protestant canons are extremely complicated, but they arose for a variety of reasons. If you talk to staunch Catholics, usually what they'll say is that Martin Luther took those books out, and if you talk to certain types of very staunch Protestants, they will say that Catholics added the books. And the actual story is something that's, of course, in between. It's important to note, though, that in the original Martin Luther and King James Bibles, all of these books were included but were in a separate section between the Old and New Testaments. So many modern Bibles will follow this same pattern. If you get a Bible that says something like Old and New Testament with Apocrypha on the front, chances are these books will be included in the middle. So when Martin Luther put his Bible together, he deemed these books to be, I wouldn't say problematic, but just sort of less valuable in terms of spiritual worth. On the other hand, he didn't feel right taking them out either. So he includes them in his Bible, which is entitled The Entirety of Scripture. So he wanted to give a more complete Bible, or the most complete Bible that he could. So he included them. But yet, on the other hand, they are in some way that's a little tough to describe, less authoritative. Now, honestly, where these books fell out of the Bible happened much later, probably in the 18th or 19th century, when particularly the British Bible Society started producing Bibles to ship overseas for missionary efforts, and it was deemed too expensive to include these books, so they were dropped out of certain editions, and ultimately that became kind of the default in Protestant Bibles. So, interesting story. Now, it gets even a little more complicated, but this is something that you should be aware of. The Eastern Orthodox canon includes some material that the Catholic canon doesn't include. So, Catholic is longer than Protestant, Eastern Orthodox is longer than Catholic. So, here are some additional books that most Eastern Orthodox include in their Bibles: the Prayer of Manasseh, First Esdras, and Third and Fourth Maccabees. So some include Fourth Maccabees, some don't, and Psalm 151. And finally, we have Oriental Orthodox, which are Orthodox groups that are further east than Eastern Orthodox. So people that would be in modern day Iraq, for example, originally in Persia, Armenia, and some of those places. Um, some groups have even more material. So the Ethiopian Orthodox, in particular, which have the longest Bible of any Christian group, include something called the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees, and other various groups include some things, exclude some things. So then it gets really complicated. But I just wanted you to know that not every Christian group has the exact same Old Testament. So when you talk about Old Testament with your Catholic friend, just be aware that they may be they may have some information in their Bible